Okay, shall we begin?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Welcome back to the next seminar in our series, East and Southeast Asia in Comparative Perspective. We are absolutely delighted this week to welcome a very prestigious speaker, Professor Ho-Keun Choi. Professor Choi is Professor of Modern European History at Korea University in Seoul. He received his doctoral degree at Bielefeld University in Germany. His publications include Max Weber Unter Historismus by Hartmann Spenner in 2000, Das Historische Western bei Simul Studies 2000, Holocaust Education in a Country Without Holocaust Experience in the Contemporary Review of Middle Eastern History, History as a Mirror, Korea's Appropriation of Germany's Experience in Rectifying the Past, Transnational Encounters Between Germany and Korea from Palgrave Macmillan in 2017, Commemorative Culture in Korea and Germany, German East Asian Encounters and Entanglements by Routledge in 2021. And moreover, he has published comparative studies of Holocaust education around the world. So we are delighted and privileged to have him to give his seminar this time, which is titled Philo and Anti-Semitism in South Korea. So Professor Choi will speak for around 30 minutes, and then there will be another 30 minutes for questions from everyone. So do please type your questions as we go along through the talk. Thank you very much, Professor Choi. Please do go ahead.
Thank you for your invitation and introduction. I will show you a PPT. The title of my today's presentation is Philo-Semitism and Anti-Semitism in South Korea. And I will observe the phenomenon anti-Semitism in South Korea in East Asian context. In May 2014, major media outlets around the world reported the results of a survey, ADL survey, stating that 53% of South Korean adults were anti-Semitic. It caused great controversy because the rate of anti-Semitism in Korea was more than twice as high as in North America, Western Europe, and other Asian countries. My research began with questions about the results of the ADL's survey. Based on the results of a single telephone survey of 500 people, South Korea has become globally recognized as a hotbed of anti-Semitism. Today, I want to talk to you about 3 points. First, I will confirm the degree of anti-Semitism among Koreans more clearly based on the extended empirical data. Then, I will compare the data with those of other countries, including China and Japan, to identify key factors affecting the development of anti-Semitic sentiments among Koreans. Finally, I'd like to tell you the implications of these data on Holocaust education in Korea and, if possible, in East Asian countries. According to the ADL's global survey, Koreans' antipathy toward the Jews ranked 22nd in the world, along with Senegal. Except for the Middle East and North Africa, there were only 3 other countries, that is Greece, Armenia, and Malaysia, in the world that showed stronger antipathy toward the Jews than Korea. Where should we look to find the reason for this phenomenon? The ADL defined respondents who answered true and probably true to more than 6 of the 11 questions as anti-Semitic. The results of Koreans' responses to each item you can see in table 5. And especially you can see number 1, number 2, 3, 6, 8, and 9. According to the ADL's survey, the top 6 items that greatly affected Koreans' negative perceptions of Jews were their loyalty to Israel, sense of collective superiority, power in the business world, influence on the international financial market, control over the global affairs, and the global media. We must compare these results with those surveys in Western Europe and North America. The first notable feature found in table 2 is that the Jewish consciousness of collective superiority was shown to be an important factor in the formation of anti-Semitic sentiments among Koreans, unlike in Western Europe and Americas. Such negative judgment ranked after the question about the loyalty of the Jews to Israel, which aroused the strongest negative sentiments among Koreans. Secondly, the high volume of references to the Holocaust by Jews, a major factor triggering negative sentiments against the Jews in the Americas and Western Europe, was considered relatively unimportant in Korea. Finally, the perception that Jewish behavior itself incites negatively toward them appears to be the least important factor in the prevalence of anti-Semitism in Korea. Further comparisons with China and Japan will be necessary to confirm the meaning of numerical features in comparison with Europe and the Americas. This is because the 2 East Asian countries, like Korea, have a much less shared history with the Jews than Western European countries and the United States. South Korea, China, and Japan share 4 of the 6 top indexes. The highest ones was number 1, 2, and 8. Loyalty to Israel appeared to be the main factor in East Asian antipathy toward the Jews, which is commonly identified in all parts of the world. A notable feature in the 3 East Asian countries was that many of their residents, unlike in Western Europe and the United States, expressed a negative attitude toward the Jewish people, believing that they appeared to have a strong sense of superiority. This was the second biggest factor in anti-Semitism in Korea and in Japan, and the biggest in China. In addition, in Korea, Japan, and China, the perception that Jews talk too much about the Holocaust was not a significant factor in anti-Semitism. When these 2 findings are combined and interpreted together, they provide meaningful insights. The great preoccupation of the people of the 3 East Asian countries with Jews' collective awareness of their own superiority can be read as a reflection of the distance between modern Western history and that of East Asia. Unlike Europeans, East Asian people did not have the opportunity to have many historical interactions with the Jews. superficial perception held by the average East Asian about Jewish history is not unrelated to the lack of awareness of the Holocaust. This has again led Koreans, Chinese, and the Japanese to avoid making negative judgments. The Jews still talk too much about the Holocaust today. In East Asia, there are still many people who do not know the meaning of the word Holocaust itself. The fact that few Koreans and the Japanese agree on the item stating that the main cause of hatred toward the Jews lies in Jewish behavior itself also support this judgment. Meanwhile, negative judgments about the Jews' influence on business world and the financial markets are strongly evident in all three East Asian countries. This appears to be a natural result of the dense interconnection and the fierce competition of the global era. Competition over the global market and the vigilance against the overwhelming power of Western financial capital are felt especially strong among Koreans. This is probably linked to the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the 2008 global financial crisis. The two shocks have provoked tremendous psychological unrest throughout Korean society. The attempts by Western capital to take over companies and banks have led to widespread fear among Koreans of sometimes exaggerated Jewish power. My interpretation so far has been based on the data provided by the ADL. After the ADL's survey was announced, I discussed the results with scholars majoring in humanities and the social sciences in Korea. None of them were convinced of this remarkable figure. It was hard to imagine the average Korean expressing such a high level of antipathy toward the Jews. Accordingly, it became obvious that it would be necessary to explain the serious gap between the results of the ADL's survey and the predictions of Korean experts. The ADL itself has expressed once that it has had difficulty accepting the credibility of the results of its own survey in Korea. This was the motivation for me, once again, to examine the attitudes of Koreans toward the Jews. To ensure the efficiency of the comparison, I conducted the survey in the same way as the ADL. Before beginning a complete investigation, I conducted a smaller scale preliminary survey. The ADL questionnaire was distributed to 168 Korean university students in June 2018. The anti-Semitism index among Korean college students was only 21%. The results are summarized in Table 3. According to the preliminary survey, 23% of men and 19% of women answered probably true or true to more than 6 of the 11 questions. The item with the most affirmative responses was number 3. Jews have too much power in international financial markets. The next question that elicited many affirmative responses was number 2. Jews have too much power in the business world. The proportion of affirmative responses to question number 8, Jews believe they are better than other people, was not much different from that of the previous survey by ADL. It can be assumed that these answers reflect the characteristics of young college students who are relatively well informed about the recent events and related to Jewish history and culture, which led to me wonder whether the views of students attending major Korean universities represented those of average Koreans. Therefore, a complete investigation was necessary to confirm that these statistics reflected the views of the entire population. Then I have conducted a new survey in August 2019. The most striking finding in the table was that 30% those surveyed expressed anti-Semitic attitudes. Compared to the results of the ADL survey, the figure was significantly reduced. There was also a significant difference between the responses of men and women. 35% of men showed anti-Semitic tendencies, while only 25% of women did. Significant differences were also observed by age group. While only 15% of young people expressed anti-Semitic attitudes, 38% of middle-aged and older people expressed negative feelings toward the Jews. When comparing the results of the two surveys, the first noticeable feature is that the rate of anti-Semitism among Korean adults fell by nearly half in the recent survey. This phenomenon is not limited to Korea. In France and Germany, for example, 3 surveys were conducted under the auspices of the ADL. France's anti-Semitism score fell from 37 to 17% in 2015 and 19. In Germany, 27% of respondents expressed anti-Semitic attitudes in the 2014 survey, but the figure plunged to 16% in 2015. These examples confirm the need for further investigation worldwide and in Korea. Now, let's take a closer look at the results of the two surveys. The most important thing to note is the difference between the survey results for items number 6 and 9. As for number 6, regarding Jews' control over the global affairs, the number of affirmative responses dropped significantly in Korea, from 52 to 21%. As for number 9, regarding Jews' control over the global media, the percentage of affirmative responses also dropped sharply from 51 to 51 to 19%. The fact that huge variations have occurred raises fundamental doubts about whether the method and the content of the ADL surveys, which were developed based on a Western context, are applicable in non-Western regions. Nonetheless, it is important to note that a considerable degree of continuity was also found between the results of the two surveys. Although there were changes in ranking, 4 indexes on both surveys remained in the top 6, that is loyalty to Israel, influence on the business world, influence on financial markets, and the Jews' perceptions of themselves as a special people. The responses of the two surveys to the last three items showed only few differences in terms of absolute figures. Where can we find the reason for such consistency? The eighth question, which took second place in the ADL's survey, took first place in my survey. I already have mentioned that this finding reflected a phenomenon found throughout Northeast Asia. At the same time, the tendency to interpret the Jews' sense of specialness as a positive trait can be considered a Korean tendency. In this regard, it is very helpful to refer to a statement made by the Jewish Rabbi Osher Litzman, who has lived in South Korea for more than 10 years. The Jewish stereotypes related to wielding influence in politics, business, or media are viewed as positives in South Korea. Many Koreans want to identify themselves with the Jewish people who have made outstanding achievements on the world stage, despite their lack of acceptance and hardships. Koreans, in response to the main items, let us examine the issue at the international level by referring to Table 5. As shown in Table 5, Koreans consider the Jewish influence unusually prominent in the fields of business and finance. In these two categories, the only region in the world where respondents gave higher proportions of affirmative answers than Korea was the Middle East and North Africa, 18 countries. This can be interpreted as resulting from a combination of following two factors. First and foremost, it can be assumed that many Koreans' absolute lack of experience with the Jewish people or knowledge of Jews negatively affected their attitudes toward the Jews. As my survey revealed, only 1 in 10 Koreans reported having had contact with the Jewish people. This indicates that respondents' information about the Jews came from indirect or superficial sources. Public education courses at the elementary, middle, and high school levels in Korea do not offer opportunities to learn about the Jewish culture or history. Thus, Western works which have influenced past generations still play a prominent role in the formation of images of Jewish people among Koreans. For example, a popular Jewish stereotype, such as that of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare, remains still influential in Korea. The second factor is related to the national economic crisis experienced by Koreans. It becomes more evident when comparing the survey data of Korea with those of neighboring China and Japan. Finally, we must compare the results of the survey of Koreans to those of the entire Asian region. The average Asian was more preoccupied with the idea that Jews are indifferent to people other than themselves. And that is number 8. And number 11, the cause of the Jewish hatred lied with Jews. In respect to the latter, number 11, only 16% of Koreans responded true or probably true. compared to 31% of Asians. So the last thing I'd like to speak, implications of the survey results for Holocaust education in Korea. With the comparison of ADL's poll and my survey, the meaningful points related to Holocaust education are summarized in 4 points. First, it is difficult to accept the anti-Semitism index of Koreans as it is, as numeric shows. Above all, take the attitudes of Koreans toward the adherents of the major religions. According to official statistics, Christians make up a quarter of the total population in Korea. They exert a strong influence in Korean society. The fact that antipathy toward Judaism appears much weaker than antipathy toward Christianity should be considered an important clue when interpreting Korea's anti-Semitic index. While 30% of the survey's respondents expressed anti-Semitism, only 2 out of 10 expressed antipathies toward Judaism. The anti-Semitism of Koreans overall seems not to be so intense as to be correlated with religious hostility. Second, the anti-Semitism of Koreans may be a product of ideological extremism. It is possibly the result of a lack of empirical foundations. Koreans did not begin to have contact with the Jews until after the Korean War, 1950, and the establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel. Under these circumstances, it is only natural that Koreans' ideas about the Jews would be infused with prejudice. Since much of Koreans' preconceptions of Jews are not based on accumulated negative experiences, they can be corrected relatively easily. Third, the impression among Koreans that Jews talk too much about the Holocaust can be considered a product of superficial observation. Based on my observations, the information related to the Holocaust that is circulating on the internet is inadequate. It appears that some of the biased information related to so-called Holocaust industry and Holocaust denial has been spread through copy and paste. Even in this context, it should be noted that the ratio of the affirming excessiveness of Jews' reference to the Holocaust is significantly lower among younger people. It suggests that the most people have access to reliable information. The least likely they are to think that Jews talk too much about the Holocaust. Finally, some other important factors should be fully considered because they determine Koreans' attitudes toward the Jews. As Konstantin Asmolov correctly pointed out, among the ADL survey's questions, the keys to determining anti-Semitism in Korea were number 4, 5, 10, and 11. The fact that most Koreans did not answer true to these questions should be taken very seriously. Moreover, the ADL questionnaire does not contain questions to confirm respondents' positive attitudes toward the Jews. Without answering such questions, investigations into specific populations' feelings toward the Jews cannot be considered anything but incomplete from the outset. Koreans' immense affinity for the Jewish people have been confirmed through various sources. First of all, traditional Jewish education is considered a model system by Koreans, and the Talmud sensational popularity in Korea is evidence of this fact. The Jews have also been lauded as a people who overcame many hardships in Korean history classes. Israel's kibbutz system is cited as a symbol of Jewish success among Koreans. Israel's high-tech industry is also an object of envy for Koreans. Koreans have a strong affinity for the Jews for many reasons. The ADL's findings cannot fully account for these sentiments, complex sentiments among Koreans. Since proper questions were not asked, there was no way for respondents to fully express their thoughts and feelings. To fully understand the Koreans' attitudes toward the Jews, above all, indexes that enable them to express their positive impressions of them must be developed. This issue is not limited to Korea, I think. The ADL's survey, which was created based on Western historical experience, has considerable limitations when administered to the peoples of non-Western regions. To comply with the true spirit of a global survey, it is urgent to expand the indexes and adapt them to various global populations. Considering these points, there is an urgent need for education about Jewish history, Jewish culture, and the Holocaust in Korean society. Holocaust education should begin with the deliberation on the disadvantages Jews have faced in reality. There are several obstacles to this. However, the academic community's level of interest in Holocaust research is quite high, unlike that of the public. This is because German and Israeli experience in coming to terms with the Holocaust is closely related to Korea's political and social struggles with its burdensome past. Given this context, the situation in Korean society regarding Holocaust education is not entirely unfavorable. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Choi. I absolutely share your desire to adapt these indexes and measurements to different populations globally. I have also found the same, I also have the same idea from my own research in Southeast Asia and in China, that a lot of these questions are misconstrued and mean different things in different contexts and must be related to the different historical development of nationalism, of ethnic belonging, all of these sort of wider questions that can be very, very different within these different contexts. So thank you very much for your presentation. And thank you also for unpicking each of the questions and embellishing them with your own research, which I thought was highly inventive and very, very impressive. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to open the floor to people. So please do feel free to type your questions and we'll put some of them to Professor Choi. And we have a number of questions from Avi Gold, who says, the first one is, South Korea has a much larger percentage of Christians than Japan or China. is there any evidence of different patterns of attitudes towards Jews among South Korean Christians than among non-Christians? So I think you answered that a little bit in your presentation, but maybe you could expand in an answer to this one now.
My point was usually religious antipathy is important point for anti-Semitism. And I'd like to tell you the religious antipathy among Koreans play a not great role in the formation of anti-Semitism. And the average antipathy ratio, 30% against Christians in Korea. It is very significant. So Koreans have the least antipathy toward Buddhism because they give accent to quietness and balance between ideological conflicts and so on. So many things Buddhism brings social peace in Korea, but Christians are divided in two parts. One is progressive and politically active, and the other is very conservative and America-oriented and anti-communist. The two parts make a struggle in everyday life and on the political level. Thus, many Koreans have antipathy, strong antipathy against the Christianity. So about Judaism, they have not enough information. So the indirect knowledge they get from the Old Testament and from pastors and so on. That's the reason. Yeah.
That's fascinating, the way it is so split like that. It suggests that society is becoming perhaps quite polarized, which is something that I have found in my own research as well. I also noted that there was quite high anti-Muslim sentiment as well, which is of course not acceptable. Where does that come into this as well? Is there a sort of xenophobia, and this is connected together against sort of outsiders? Is this part of sort of a wider xenophobic discourse?
There are two reasons. 40% of Koreans have antipathy against Muslims and religion. There are, I think, two reasons. The one is they have not enough information and they don't know the historical context of the Middle East countries. So many people have impression from CNN and so on. They are possible terrorists. And the September 11 gave us a very strong, unforgettable image. That is one, superficial information. And the second is important, more important. We have more than 1 billion guest workers. And the most of them come from Pakistan and Afghanistan and Philippines, Indonesia, and so on. And some of them have Muslim religion, and their cultural habits is somewhat different from the Korean one. And for example, Koreans now have a very sensitive feeling of private property. So, and they have many park lots and so on, and many of the workers from Muslim countries have a community consciousness, and so they have
that is a very interesting observation.
From the low classes. They struggle for a job, and after the guest workers came, the average wage of the working class at the building and so on down, slowly down. That is the important reason why the average Koreans have antipathy Muslims and the religion.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that explanation. We have some questions, so I'm going to read some out. Another question from Avi Gold, who would also actually really like to have your contact details because they are interested in your research. So maybe you could type your email address if you're comfortable into the chat, or we could pass it along if Avi contacts us at ISGAP. But we have a question here, which is regarding the possibility that anti-Semitism in Korea may be the result of ideological extremism. Can you elaborate on this? What ideological movements are most likely behind this? And it also actually connects to Navras, his question also, which is, what is that ideological extremism to which you attribute South Korean anti-Semitism? And I am very interested in this too, sort of what discourses of extremism are developing here. Are they kind of right-wing? Are they online? Do we have anything developing like the American or the Chinese alt-right in cyberspace right now? So perhaps you could talk about this ideological extremism.
Yeah, that is not a formal ideology. I think with the term. Some part, there are two roots in ideological extremism. The one is, do you know the Pastor Moonism?
Yes, a little bit. Yes, I know a little bit about that.
The followers of Moonism, for example, they believe they are genuine selected people from the God, and they have a strong envy against Jews. So that comes from religious roots, and nobody can mitigate the religious belief. So that is one of the ideological extremism. And the other roots is we have images and the news in Middle East and West Bank Jordan and Gaza. There are many conflicts and raid and so killings by the two sides, but mostly the Israeli soldiers. So some of the Koreans believe the Jews were victims in the Holocaust, but now they are perpetrators and they forgot the history, or they have no lesson from the tragic history. So it is a prediction, it is feeling, and with information we can the context and it's a marginal phenomenon and so on. That makes no revision. So that is a kind of belief. I mean, the ideological extremism is not a high class belief system, but from the feeling, belief. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Actually, building on that and building on the issue around sort of victimhood and the construction of victims somewhat, Navras has asked a very interesting question that I will read out. And this actually links back to another talk in our series, which was about the notion of different forms of trauma in the world and the competition between the survivors of trauma. Navras asks, does the tendency to indulge in competitive victimhood exist among the South Koreans? Do they compare their suffering at the hands of the Japanese during World War II with that of the Jews during the Holocaust, and consider and try to project their suffering to greater than that of the Jews? So amounting to the trivialization and obfuscation of the Holocaust. So this was something that one of our speakers talking about Japan actually referred to quite a bit. So is there this kind of situation where there is an element of competitive victimhood in Korea at all?
So,
are you okay? Would you like me to repeat the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is about, oh, go ahead, Navras.
Ho-Keun, should you like, you can also read the question in the chat box if that is helpful. It's also there in the chat box. It's the last question in the chat box.
Yeah, I will check it. Yeah, it's a complex question, and I will answer plain. So many Koreans have sympathize the victim experience of the Jews, and sometimes the focus of Korean remembrance in regarding the Second World War and the Holocaust is the Germans were perpetrators, and they have reflected and compensated, but the Japanese do not. So it's a very parallel and simple way of think. So the complex connotations and the context of the Holocaust history, the Koreans don't have interest in that. So the Germans are regrettable, but the Japanese did not. So they believe. And by the way, for me and other Koreans have sometimes exaggerated or preoccupied with the victim experience during the Japanese rule. So they sometimes feel the same victimhood feeling with Holocaust survivors, especially the Korean sexual slave for Japanese army. They have started to make meeting and discussions in the United States and in other countries. So Holocaust survivors, especially women survivors, the Koreans identified them with the sexual slaves of Korean for the Japanese army. They make a simple and make a schematic understanding for complex history. So I try to tell the Japanese try their efforts to harmonize and reflection and their movement against the right-wing political leaders in Japan. But Korean mass media delivered the news very seldom.
That's very interesting. I do remember reading about the issue of comfort women and the recognition that was needed towards this atrocity in history. Thank you for that answer. That was very. I think you articulate how complex this situation is, the competitive victimhood situation, and we have had a few scholars talk about this issue, and it is so difficult. Actually, that did actually bring me to one issue that I also wanted to ask about. It seemed that when the ADL survey came out, there was a lot of shock towards this in Korea, and it sounds like you and your colleagues and the scholars in the field were quite disturbed by this, and that you have really done well looking into it as an issue. So really well done for that. One issue that I found quite intriguing from your own data was the split in gender in some of your research. Do you have an explanation for that?
Yeah, I have the results of ADL survey worldwide. I have screened it, and there is usually a evident tendency. The women are showed mild tendency to regarding anti-Semitism. 3% or 4-5% lower they are usually, and the empirical law represented in Korea, and the point is somewhat higher, the difference of the point. And intrinsically, I think women try to understand, and they are against war and killings and so on. I didn't I didn't ask the women or my students, why do you, why do you? So it is, there is no data, there is no reason, but I have only the raw data in my hands.
That would be maybe I will have to read up to see if there's more more information about that slightly gendered split out there. But thank you very much. We're almost at the end, but I think I have time for one more question. My own research into anti-Semitism in China is sort of uncovering and pointing towards the growth of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories online in cyberspace, and how this is becoming quite prominent as part of kind of right-wing discourse. Is there any such online presence or online growth in Korean cyberspace now that sort of there is access to more of these global anti-Semitic conspiracy theories? Do you see that emerging in Korean cyberspace at all?
Yeah, so I couldn't find my real colleague in the study of this area. So as a guerrilla scholar, I'm fighting with many enemies, any possible enemies, and I feel myself sometimes I'm a philosophers in 18th century France or Western Europe. So before 17 years, I was the first who wrote a book on Holocaust in Korea, the first. And the Holocaust education, for Holocaust education, I'm giving seed on the soil. And I hope many possible colleagues among my students. So there is no sincere studies, empirical studies on that phenomenon you mentioned. In 5 or 10 years, I will have many colleagues, younger colleagues, and I will give my baton, but to them.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Choi. There were a few more questions, but unfortunately couldn't get around to them. But I think you have talked for long enough, because thank you for the effort you put in and for your quite fascinating empirical and original data. It was a joy to learn about this, and thank you for sharing it with us. And we wish you all the best on your quest to promote Holocaust education in Korea, and also to inspire generations of scholars as well. So thank you from me and Navras and from everyone at ISGAP, and good night.
Thank you.